Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing our speaker, Jad Adams. Now, Jad, as you probably read in the programme, if you don't know him already, is an academic, a TV producer and journalist, as well as an author. He's written on politics, including books on votes for women, biographies of Tony Benn, Gandhi and the Clintons. But we, of course, are here today to talk about and hear about decadence. Who better than a man who's written books called Hideous Absinthe and Decadent Women, Yellow Book Lives. Now, that book was described as part literary history, part social history, and entirely delightful. So it's entirely delightful to have Jad here today to talk about his book about Ernest Dowson, Madder Music, Stronger Wine, and introduce Jad Adams.
Yay. Well, thank you very much. It's so good to be here and to see so many old friends and new friends, and some friends who are so close I saw them just yesterday at the Dowson event that we had at Goldsmiths College. I'm going to talk here today about the close relationship between Ernest Dowson and Oscar Wilde. What connection really could there be between Ernest Dowson and Oscar Wilde? Dowson was dishevelled, Wilde was fastidious. Dowson was always careless of his wardrobe, even when well dressed. He looked as if he'd slept in his clothes, which, to be honest, he often had. Dowson would frequently drink to excess and get into fights, which is not something which even his enemies accused Wilde of doing. Physically, Dowson was slight, Wilde was robust. Dowson was hesitant, Wilde was determined. Wilde was famously witty, but Dowson's utterances are mainly unmemorable. The only one which is repeated, absinthe makes the tart grow fonder, is the repetition in a letter of some witticism which Dowson had heard. He didn't coin it. So how did these two people become such friends? Well, there are things that they had in common. Both, of course, were active writers in the 1890s in London, both published with a bodily head. Both were Oxford men, Dowson, Magdalen, and Wilde, Magdalen, and Dowson at Queen's. Both poets and short story writers. Dowson wasn't significantly a playwright. He wrote one act play. Both were attenders at the Rhymers Club for new and emerging writers of poetry. Dowson was a Catholic convert. Wilde showed fondness for the Catholic Church as a student and eventually converted on his deathbed, as you know. Dowson's predilection for girls and Wilde's for boys were not smiled upon by society, but were tolerated by most of their own acquaintances. Dowson was not an influential figure as Wilde was, though he had strong opinions about art, which were much respected in his own circle. These two men first met at the Rhymers Club in January 1891, when it met at the Hobby Horse House, which is in Fitzroy Street. They used to meet in the Cheshire Cheese, which is literally down the road from there and on the left. At this time, Dowson was working in the family dock and working at the Critic magazine, writing 2 novels, leading an active social life, as well as writing occasional poetry and stories. Wilde had been working as editor of Woman's World and was enjoying the success of The Picture of Dorian Gray with its serial publication in Lippincotts. The evening was described as Oscar arrived late, but he was much celebrated when he did arrive. Another writer said, "Round Oscar Wilde hovered reverently Lionel Johnson and Ernest Dowson. I marvelled at the time to notice the fascination which Wilde exercised over the otherwise rational. He sat, as it were, enthroned and surrounded by a deferential circle. Johnson's diminutive size and Dowson's slight build must have increased the comic effect of the 2 young poets paying literary homage to Wilde." After this, Dowson and Wilde would see each other occasionally. A fellow rhymer, Victor Pla, contemptuously describes, "A telegram came one day from Oscar Wilde. peremptorily ordering Dowson to appear at the Café Royal to lunch with the great man. Dowson's excitement was marked. He was flattered and flustered. Dowson knew that his debt to Wilde was considerable, and that Wilde was setting a tone in literary society in which Dowson's work could flourish. On another occasion, which has been recorded, Dowson went to see Wilde at the Berkeley Hotel in Piccadilly. It was quite early, but he found Wilde in bed, propped up with pillows, pasting newspaper cuttings about himself in a large scrapbook. Dowson was a creature of pubs. Wilde wasn't, but he would sometimes call in at the Crown, which is just north of Cranbourne Street, just up from Piccadilly, near to the Hippodrome. Wilde would drop in with Robert Ross and with John Gray. Gray in particular was to become a close friend of Ernest Dowson, and Dowson was also a friend of Alfred Douglas. During the year of trials for Wilde in 1895, Dowson had his own problems. The breakup of Dowson's personality took place at this time due to multiple factors. The death of his parents within 6 months of each other, probably both due to suicide. The manifestation of Dowson's tuberculosis, which meant his days were clearly numbered. The impending failure of his hopeless relationship with a young girl. His unsuccessful attempts to find work, which would keep him at more than anything but starvation level, and the collapse of the family business, which had at least given him a home and an income. However, despite these problems that Dowson had, he found time to comfort Wilde in Wilde's hour of need. In a break between the trials in 1895, when Wilde was out on trial, Robert Sherard said to Wilde, "Oscar, may I bring Ernest Dowson to see you this evening? He would very much like to come." And Wilde said, "Oh, bring him by all means. He's an Oxford man and a fine writer of poetry and of prose, and it will do me good to have a causerie with him." Sherard kept Dowson sober all afternoon, no easy task, and in the evening they went to Oakley Street, Lady Wilde's home, where Dowson and Wilde sat together in the front room. Dowson stayed till long after dark. Neither of them spoke very much, but when they did, it was mainly about artistic matters. Sherard said the evening was one of the pleasantest that Wilde had enjoyed during his brief period of liberty. Dowson went to court with Sherard on the 25th of May, 1895, when the verdict was to be given. The two sat in the courtroom, and Sherard looked around and realised that of all the friends who had swarmed around Wilde in his early years of triumph, he could see only 3 of them there to support him in his hour of need: himself, Ernest Dowson, and Lord Douglas of Howick. I know that Robbie Ross was also present, but perhaps either Sherard overlooked him or he was outside the courtroom. The courage shown by Dowson in attending Wilde's trial as a supporter of the accused can be contrasted with the behaviour of John Gray, who instructed a barrister to attend the trial with a watching brief to note if he were mentioned in order that he might be protected from scandal. While former friends like W.E. Henley were advising suicide for Wilde, Dowson described him as that poor victim of English hypocrisy. He continued his support. One night in Paris, Charles Whibley, the Pall Mall Gazette's French correspondent, had Ernest Dowson put out of a cafe on the boulevards because Dowson took him to task about his censorious attitude to Oscar Wilde. In February 1896, he went to see Wilde's Salome in the original French in the theatre at de l'Oeuvre with Aubrey Beardsley and Gabrielle de Lautrec. And Dowson wrote a long account of the enthusiasm with which it was received to Constance Wilde, one of a number of examples of the solicitude with which Dowson acted towards Wilde and those who'd been caught up in the Wilde debacle. Wilde was released in May 1897, went into exile in France. As soon as Dowson knew where Wilde was, he arranged to see him. He visited in June 1897 in the company of Charles Conder and Dalhousie Young. Wilde behaved with his usual generosity and hospitality, as if he'd suffered nothing in the past 2 years, grateful for the visit of these men who he called the poet, the philosopher, and the painter. Presumably to give Young his true job title of composer would have been at the expense of alliteration. Wilde wrote to Alfred Douglas, Ernest Dowson, Condor and Dow Young have come out here this afternoon to dine and sleep. At least I know they dine, I believe they never sleep. And they were actually up talking till 3 in the morning. Wilde wrote to Dowson around June the 5th, 1897, it was most kind of you to come to see me, and I thank you sincerely and gratefully for your pleasant companionship and the many gentle ways by which you recalled that once at any rate I was a lord of language and had myself the soul of a poet. Dowson had concealed his personal suffering, as he often did, so as not to impede his friend's pleasure. But Dowson wrote to Colonel O'Riordan, I had some difficulty in suppressing my own sourness and attuning myself to his enormous joy in life at this moment. But hopefully I left him with the impression that I had not a care in the world. He was in wonderful form, but has changed a good deal. He seems of much broader sympathies, much more human and simple, and his delight in the country, in walking, in the simplicities of life, is enchanting. These were peaceful days, despite Dowson's heartache. Wilde wrote, Ernest had an absinthe under the apple trees of another visit, and he'd breakfasted with Dowson at Arc, following which Dowson travelled back to Berneval with him and stayed the night. Dowson wrote of Wilde, his gorgeous spirits cheered me mightily. I was amused by the unconscious contrast between his present talk about his changed position and his notions of economy and his practice, which is perversely extravagant. Wilde became very attached to Dowson, writing to him, there's a fatality about our being together that is astounding, or rather quite probable. Had I stayed at Arc, I should have given up all hope of ever separating from you. Why are you so persistently and so perversely wonderful? Do I see you tomorrow? Try to come over. Come with vine leaves in your hair. When they did meet again, Dowson stayed 3 days with him. Around this time, Wilde dined with Fritz Thaulow, who was a Norwegian landscape artist. And he asked the artist, what do you think of our young friend, the poet? And Thaulow replied, it's a pity he drinks so much absinthe. Wilde shrugged and said, if he didn't drink, he would be someone else. You must accept someone for what he is. It's not regrettable that a poet is drunk, but that drunks aren't always poets. Wilde seemed increasingly to rely on Dowson, writing to him through June in the most insistent terms. For example, from the Café Suisse in Dieppe. Do come here at once. Monsieur Meyer is presiding over a morning meal of absinthe, and we want you. And I must see you, so I propose to breakfast at the Saint-Martin-l'Église tomorrow at 11:30, and you must come. Take a voiture and be there. I want to have a poet to talk to, as I have lots of bad news since you left me. Do try, like a good chap, to be there, and wear a blue tie. I want to be consoled. Tonight I'm going to read your poems, your lovely lyrics, words with wings you write always. It's an exquisite gift, fortunately rare, in an age where prose is more poetic than it is poetry. Dowson paid back his friend's hospitality with his company, and according to an anecdote, which I can't justify, an attempt to convert Wilde to heterosexuality. W.B. Yeats is the source for this tale, about which he said, Dowson claimed to have attempted to reform him at Dieppe. Dowson and Wilde were in a cafe in Dieppe, and Dowson pressed upon his companion the necessity of acquiring a more wholesome taste. Chivied by this, Wilde consented to visit the local brothel, though they doubted they had the funds for such an excursion. They emptied their pockets onto the cafe table, and though there wasn't much, there was enough if both heaps were put together into one. Meanwhile, the news had spread, and they set out accompanied by a cheering crowd. Arriving at their destination, Dowson and the crowd remained outside. Presently, Wilde returned from inside, and he said in a low voice to Dowson, the first these 10 years and it will be the last. And he said aloud, so that the crowd might hear, but tell it in England. for it will entirely restore my character. Dowson introduced Wilde to Smithers, who lived up to his boast, "I will publish anything that the others are afraid of," when he published Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol in February 1898. Wilde advanced money to Dowson and paid his hotel bill. They had a little disagreement about that because Dowson had trouble getting the money back to him. It was held up in the post. 1899 was probably their last meeting. Oscar Wilde had returned to Paris, and he and Dowson ran into each other on a Paris street. Wilde went to a cafe with Dowson, but the poet's desperate amusements weren't to Wilde's taste. Wilde wrote to Smithers that Dowson forced me to go to the Pantheon at midnight. It was dreadful, a cafe pandemonium. Later in the summer, he sent a copy of the published play An Ideal Husband to Dowson, and that's the last contact between them. Dowson died in Catford at the home of Robert Sherard in February 1900. Sherard had found him in a wretched lodging house in Euston that he couldn't afford to pay for. Sherard later went to Paris after Dowson's death and went to visit Wilde at the Hotel d'Alsace in the Rue des Beaux-Arts. Sherard was at first turned away by a hotel porter who told him Wilde was too tired to see anyone. He'd been drinking that day. Later that day, Sherard returned and sent up a message. "Sorry to hear you're tired, Oscar. I've come to Paris from Ernest Dowson's deathbed. He died in my arms. I thought you might like to hear about him and the messages he bade me take to you." He was allowed in and found Wilde in a dressing gown. Sherard told him of Dowson's death, about which he didn't seem to Sherard to be too interested. The reason is probably that he found it all too painful to come to terms with immediately. He said, "It is all so sad. Ernest was an enfant voué à noir, a child doomed to darkness. Much of what he has written will remain." Later, Oscar Wilde wrote a more considered view of his friend to Leonard Smithers. "I am greatly distressed to hear of Ernest's death. How sudden it must have been. Poor wounded wonderful fellow that he was, a tragic reproduction of all tragic poetry, like a symbol or a scene. I hope bay leaves will be laid on his tomb, and rue and myrtle too, for he knew what love is." Robert Sherard said Wilde had a very high respect for Dowson's literary gifts and showed him actual deference. This was despite the fact that Ernest Dowson was not at all the kind of man with whom Wilde would ever have cared to associate, for he was untidy, even dirty in his dress. He was usually drunk and at most times, when so, noisy and boisterous. Yet Oscar Wilde, because he admired his genius, was at all times glad to see him. So to give some indication of what it was that Wilde saw in Dowson, to give a little of the philosophy of Dowson finally, why Wilde so admired him, a character in Dowson's book, A Comedy of Masks, was something of a self-portrait of Dowson. And this character was said to lapse from the eloquence to the incoherence of drunkenness, rather as Dowson did. This character justified himself by saying, "I may fail or I may succeed, as the world counts these things. It is all the same. I believe in myself." In another book of Dowson's, Adrian Rome is the central character, and his philosophy is to be concerned with high passions, to live as fully and intensely as one could, rather than as long and peacefully as one might. It seemed to him that it was only under such conditions that the born artist could properly work out his salvation. That is the message of Dowson's life, and it's one which Wilde saw through the superficial squalor and which Wilde admired. Thank you very much for
here. Try and do it from here. Okay. If you can hear me. First of all, it is, if I may just say personally, it is wonderful to be at an Oscar Wilde Society event and see all our friends around here, some of whom I haven't seen for quite a while, one way or another. And it is wonderful to have an Oscar Wilde gathering of the traditional sort, which we do so well. Jad, I read your book, and I was so taken with the vividness with which you told the story, and this is even more so in the talk you've given just now. I think you were able to give us by flashes of illumination, one after another, a real understanding of the friendship between Oscar Wilde and Dowson, and of the opinion they had of each other, and the extent to which they learned from each other and had inspiration from each other. And I thought it was conveyed absolutely marvellously, if I may say so. And we were all listening. You couldn't hear a pin drop because we were all enjoying it so much. Thank you so much, Jad, for a lovely talk, and couldn't have enjoyed it more. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You.